Lila had always been invisible, or at least that's how it felt to her. She was small, fragile, and unremarkable by every worldly standard, yet her heart held a quiet strength that no one ever noticed. Born into poverty, orphaned at a young age, and forced to survive in a city that had no mercy for those weaker than themselves, she had learned to move carefully, speak softly, and avoid drawing attention. The world had trained her to be unseen, and she had become a master of invisibility, not by choice but by necessity. Her days were a blur of cleaning marble halls, carrying trays of wine, sweeping courtyards, and enduring the subtle cruelties of the nobles who lived in the palace. Every day brought a fresh humiliation, whether it was a noble tossing a harsh remark, a spoiled child throwing food in her direction, or a wealthy visitor mocking her simple attire. Lila had learned long ago that crying aloud or defending herself only invited more scorn. So she endured silently, bowing her head and whispering apologies that no one heard, carrying on as though her life were nothing more than a series of chores designed to break her spirit. One evening, the palace was alive with the clinking of crystal goblets, the soft melodies of a harp, and the laughter of nobles celebrating another of their frivolous victories. Lila was assigned to carry trays of wine to the ballroom. She moved cautiously, balancing each glass with careful precision. Her heart pounded not from fear of dropping the drinks, but from the sharp, cutting stares of the guests, each of whom delighted in reminding her of her lowly status. Whispers followed her wherever she went, mocking her torn uniform and the dirt smudged across her hands. As she rounded a polished marble corner, one of the young nobles, a boy barely older than her, yet full of entitlement and cruelty, shoved her roughly. The tray toppled. Wine splashed across the marble floors and crystal glasses shattered into countless pieces, glittering dangerously in the candlelight. Lila's hands trembled, her knees weak, and for a moment she felt as though the entire hall was laughing directly at her. The sound of the noble's cruel laughter pierced her like a blade. Tears welled in her eyes, but Lila refused to cry out. She bent carefully to pick up the shards, murmuring apologies under her breath, each word swallowed by the hall's mocking echoes. She cleaned the floor with trembling hands, feeling the sharp edges of glass slice tiny lines across her palms. No one offered help. No one offered mercy. The humiliation was complete, yet she endured, refusing to let her pain be loud enough to entertain their amusement. She finished the task silently, bowed deeply, and retreated to the shadows of the hallways, wishing desperately to disappear. And then she noticed him. Kaelen, the vampire king, stood at the far end of the corridor, partially hidden in shadow. His presence was immediately commanding, impossible to ignore, and yet utterly silent. His reputation preceded him, feared across kingdoms, whispered about in legends and respected, or obeyed, without question. Even the bravest of nobles dared not approach him without trembling. And yet here he was watching her. Not with anger. Not with cruelty. Not with judgment. But with curiosity. He had seen countless humans in his centuries of life, many weak, some cunning, some cruel, some kind and brave. But in Lila he saw something rare. He saw endurance without complaint, bravery without pride, and kindness without expectation. She had been humiliated publicly, mocked relentlessly, and yet she had not lashed out, not begged, and not broken. Her dignity, fragile as it seemed, had endured the cruelty of the world. In that moment, Kaelen's attention, which had never been easily captured, was fully taken by her. He did not step forward. He did not announce his presence. He simply watched, letting her human vulnerability unfold before him. There was something magnetic in her silence, something that drew him in deeper than he expected. Centuries of ruling, centuries of observing humanity, had never prepared him for someone like Lila, a human girl who radiated quiet strength despite being utterly powerless in the eyes of the world. By the time she finished cleaning the shards and retreated to her tiny quarters, exhausted and trembling, Kaelen had already decided that she was someone worth noticing, someone worth protecting. His choice was made silently, as all things of consequence were in his immortal life. That night, Lila awoke to find a single black rose on her pillow. Its petals were velvety, flawless, and seemingly impossible under the dim candlelight. She picked it up carefully, her fingers brushing the delicate petals. A strange flutter coursed through her chest, one she could neither explain nor name. Something about the rose felt alive, almost as if it carried a whisper, a silent promise of protection from someone unseen. Lila did not understand why her heart raced or why her dreams that night were filled with shadowed corridors and a tall, imposing figure she could not see clearly. She simply knew that the rose meant something significant. It was a gift that no one else in her world could have imagined. Someone somewhere was taking notice of her, and for the first time in her life she felt a spark of hope. This small act, the gift of a single black rose, was not merely a symbol of protection. It was the first thread in a bond that would soon entwine her life with Kaelen's centuries-long existence. It marked the beginning of a journey from invisibility to recognition, from weakness to empowerment, from suffering to destiny. Lila, the girl who no one noticed, had unknowingly caught the attention of the most powerful being in the kingdom, a vampire king whose heart had remained closed for centuries. And Kaelen, watching silently from the shadows, felt something stir within him that he had thought impossible. Curiosity, fascination, and the faintest glimmer of longing. For the first time in 100 years, his attention was drawn not to power, conquest, or fear, but to the fragile, trembling hands of a human girl who had endured everything life had thrown at her, and yet, somehow, remained kind. The palace remained unchanged, the nobles continued their frivolities, and life moved on as usual. But for Lila and Kaelen, everything had shifted. Invisible walls had begun to crumble. Destinies had begun to align. And the slow, inevitable journey of a human girl and a vampire king had quietly begun, with a single black rose acting as the first silent messenger of fate. By the time dawn broke, Lila held the rose close, unaware of the centuries of history, the immense power, and the danger that lingered beyond the palace walls. She only knew that her life felt different. Something was watching, something was protecting, and something was about to change everything she thought she knew about herself, and about the world around her. The story of the girl who no one noticed had begun. The black rose had vanished by morning, leaving only a faint scent of midnight petals lingering in Lila's small quarters. She traced her fingers over the delicate folds, the memory of the velvety petals still vivid. Something inside her stirred, a strange warmth, a flutter of hope, but she pushed it away. Life had taught her to expect nothing but hardship, to accept invisibility as her natural state. And yet, for the first time in years, Lila wondered if the world might hold something unexpected for her. Days passed, but the palace remained the same in its surface appearance. Nobles continued their mockery, servants whispered in shadows, and Lila's chores seemed endless. Still, something invisible had changed. Kaelen, the vampire king, continued to watch her from the shadows, his presence silent but all-encompassing. He was patient, observing without interference, letting her move through her small human struggles unperturbed. There was a subtle fascination in the way he studied her. Her gentle hands, the way she straightened a tattered cloak without complaint, her soft murmurs of comfort for the frightened animals in the stables. What Kaelen did not yet know, though he would soon discover, was that Lila was no ordinary human girl. From a young age she had possessed a strange gift, a secret she had never shared even with herself. She could feel the life force of others, sense the faint tremors of pain, and sometimes in moments of quiet desperation, bring small relief to injuries or illnesses. As a child she had thought it was magic, but magic was forbidden, dangerous, and unpredictable. So she had hidden her gift, burying it under layers of fear, humility, and survival instinct. One afternoon the gift revealed itself in a way she could no longer ignore. A young stable boy had fallen while leading a frightened horse, scraping his arms and twisting his ankle. The boy cried out, clutching the wound, tears streaking his dirt-smudged face. Lila knelt beside him instinctively, whispering gentle reassurances. As her hands hovered over his injuries, a faint, warm light radiated from her palms, soft as dawn. The boy gasped as the pain eased, his bruises fading before his eyes. The moment passed in silence and Lila felt a tremor of fear. What had she just done? Kaelen, hidden in the shadows of the stable loft, watched with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. For centuries he had seen human ability, human cunning, human resilience, but never anything like this. Lila's power was subtle yet profound. It did not destroy, it healed. It did not intimidate, it comforted. And in that moment, the vampire king realized something that startled even him. This fragile human girl who the world had ignored and humiliated, possessed a gift that rivaled the influence of kings and armies. But the discovery went deeper than mere power. That evening, while cleaning in the palace library, Lila stumbled upon a tome of ancient knowledge, dusty and forgotten. Its pages were brittle, written in a language she did not fully understand. Yet, without thinking, she whispered a phrase aloud. The words rolled off her tongue in the long-lost tongue of vampire royalty, a language so old it had not been spoken aloud for centuries. The moment she spoke, the air around her seemed to hum. Shadows shifted, and Kaelen, who had been observing from the alcove, froze. Those words were not random. They were recognition, a signal that Lila was not only extraordinary but somehow destined for more than she could imagine. Only someone connected to the vampire royal bloodline, or someone fated to become the king's queen, could speak such words with the understanding and resonance she had unknowingly commanded. Centuries of experience had taught Kaelen to recognize destiny when he saw it. And now, destiny had walked into his world, a trembling, fragile human girl whose heart was pure and courage was understated but unyielding. Despite the magnitude of what he observed, Kaelen did not approach her. Not yet. He understood patience. He had waited a century for the right moment, and he would not rush it. Instead, he retreated to the shadows, silently marking her as someone worth watching, someone worth protecting. Lila continued her life unaware of how closely the most powerful vampire in the kingdom followed her every movement, unaware that each act of kindness, each small demonstration of bravery, had captivated a being who had ruled with fear and force for centuries. Lila herself felt a strange stirring inside her. The glowing warmth in her hands when she healed the boy, the words she spoke aloud in the ancient language, and the lingering scent of the black rose, all of it seemed to connect to something she could not yet name. She felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. What was happening to her? Why did she feel stronger, more alive when she helped others even in the smallest ways? Her life, once defined by invisibility and suffering, was subtly shifting. The humiliations in the palace no longer seemed quite as sharp. The cruel laughter of the nobles began to fade in importance compared to the small victories she achieved every day, comforting an injured animal, soothing a frightened servant, or simply surviving yet another day in a world that sought to break her. Unbeknownst to Lila, these acts were building a reputation, not among the nobles but in the gaze of Kaelen, who recognized the bravery and resilience of someone truly remarkable. It was in these quiet moments of human kindness that Kaelen felt his heart, long frozen by centuries of solitude, stir for the first time in ages. He had been fascinated by human strength before, but never by something so pure, so selfless, and yet so powerful in its subtlety. Lila's gift was not just healing, it was proof of character, a reflection of the soul beneath the fragile exterior, and a sign that this girl whom the world overlooked had a destiny intertwined with his own. That night, Kaelen moved silently through the palace as always, unseen and yet aware of her presence. He left nothing this time, no rose, no message, yet he lingered for a moment near her window watching her sleep. She was unaware of the significance of her gift, unaware of the eyes that observed her every act, and unaware that her simple acts of courage had begun to shape the course of history. For Lila, the world had not yet revealed its full danger or its full promise. She only knew that a new sense of possibility had entered her life. The invisible girl who had suffered so much, who had endured humiliation and hardship, had begun to awaken to her own power. And in the shadows, the vampire king, whose heart had waited a century for a spark of destiny, had found it in her. Their story was only beginning, and the threads of fate were slowly weaving them together. Lila's secret power would soon change her life, protect her from danger, and draw her closer to a vampire king who had waited far longer than she could imagine for a soul like hers. And for the first time she felt the whisper of hope that she might not be alone, and that perhaps, just perhaps, the world had more in store for her than endless suffering. The palace had always been a place of beauty and terror. Glittering chandeliers reflected the candlelight off polished marble floors, and the soft music of harps and lutes drifted through the corridors. Yet beneath the grandeur, cruelty lingered like a shadow. Lila had learned to navigate it with quiet caution. Every day was a careful dance, balancing humility with endurance, obedience with survival. She carried out her chores without complaint, speaking only when necessary, always careful not to draw attention to herself. That evening, Lila was assigned to serve the courtyard during a late-night gathering of nobles. The moon hung low and silver over the palace gardens, casting long eerie shadows. She carried trays of food and wine with steady hands, despite her exhaustion. Her small, fragile frame moved through the crowd, unnoticed by all except the occasional mocking glance or whispered insult. One noble, a young man with a cruel smirk, decided to make her the center of his amusement. He leaned over and whispered insults into her ear, laughing when she flinched. The other nobles followed his lead, circling around her like predators. They mocked her torn uniform, her smudged hands, and her trembling hands as she tried to maintain her balance with the trays. One of them drew a dagger from his belt, twirling it between his fingers, and the laughter became sharper, colder. Lila froze. She had no weapon, no allies, nothing to defend herself. Her heart pounded, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow into fear, the fear of humiliation, of pain, of being completely powerless. But then a presence swept through the courtyard. The air shifted, heavy and chilling like the calm before a storm. Shadows seemed to deepen and stretch unnaturally, and the laughter faltered. From the darkness, Kaelen appeared. His movements were fluid and silent, yet every step radiated authority and danger. His eyes, dark and fathomless, swept over the group of nobles with a calm intensity that froze them in place. Even the one holding the dagger faltered, unable to look away. Kaelen did not move hastily, nor did he strike. He simply stood, a figure of impossibly dark elegance, his cloak brushing the marble floor. The faint glint of his fangs caught the moonlight, and the air around him seemed to hum with a power that had been cultivated over centuries. The nobles' bravado crumbled in an instant. Laughter died in their throats, replaced by a growing sense of dread. They had heard stories of the Vampire King, but seeing him in person, so close, so absolute, was a different terror entirely. "Leave her," Kaelen said, his voice low and impossible to ignore. It carried no threat, yet the weight of it crushed the courage of anyone who heard it. "Or you will answer to me." The nobles scattered, tripping over themselves in a panic, leaving the courtyard empty but for Lila and Kaelen. Her legs shook as she realized what had just happened. She had been saved again, not by chance or by luck, but by a being of unimaginable power who had chosen to intervene. Her chest heaved with a mixture of fear, awe, and something else, something unnameable that fluttered in her heart. Kaelen's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, not with judgment but with recognition. He had seen her courage in countless small acts, her patience with the animals in the stables, her kindness to the injured servants, her endurance in the face of daily humiliation. And now he saw it amplified under immediate danger. Lila's bravery, quiet and unassuming, had drawn his attention fully. She had no idea who he was, nor the weight of what had just transpired, yet he had already marked her as someone to protect, someone extraordinary. Lila, trembling, could barely speak. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. But Kaelen did not reply. Words were unnecessary. His presence alone had conveyed the depth of his protection and the seriousness of the threat he had just eliminated. He inclined his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement of her courage, and then, as silently as he had appeared, he vanished into the shadows, leaving Lila alone under the moonlight. The memory of that night lingered long after the nobles had been dismissed and the courtyard emptied. Lila held herself together, cleaning the trays she had carried, but her mind was elsewhere. A million questions swirled in her head. Who was he? Why did he care about me? Why did my heart race when I felt his presence? She did not know that the Vampire King had observed her every movement, had watched the subtle way her hands healed a scraped knee or soothed a frightened child, and had chosen to step into her life at the precise moment of greatest need. For Kaelen, the events of that night were monumental. He had ruled kingdoms, commanded armies, and struck fear into the hearts of thousands, yet none of that had captured his attention like Lila. She was human, fragile, mortal, and yet, in her small acts of courage and kindness, she had displayed a strength that rivaled the most powerful warriors he had ever known. Her power was not one of conquest or domination, but one of resilience, empathy, and heart. And in that moment, Kaelen's centuries-long isolation began to shift. He felt the faint stirrings of something long buried, fascination, curiosity, and the beginnings of a bond he had waited 100 years to recognize. That night, as Lila lay in her quarters, the silence of her room was filled with questions and unease. She held the black rose he had left on her pillow days before, its petals soft and fragrant, and realized something profound. She was no longer invisible. Someone powerful, someone extraordinary was watching her. Someone who could protect her from the cruelty of the world had stepped into her life. The significance of the rose, the shadowed presence in the courtyard, and the inexplicable sense of safety that washed over her were the first threads of a bond that would soon intertwine their fates. Lila did not yet understand it, but her life had shifted. She had survived humiliation, endured cruelty, and now, against all odds, the impossible had happened. A Vampire King had noticed her, and the slow, inevitable path toward protection, respect, and destiny had begun. In the days that followed, the memory of that night remained vivid. Lila moved through her duties with the same humility, the same quiet strength, yet there was a subtle change in her demeanor. She no longer felt entirely powerless. Somewhere, in the shadows of the palace, Kaelen continued to watch, waiting for the moment when her courage and her secret power would reveal themselves fully. And for the first time, Lila felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile but undeniable spark. Maybe she was meant for more than invisibility, humiliation, and suffering. Maybe, just maybe, destiny had begun to take notice of her. The days that followed the courtyard incident were quiet yet charged with anticipation. Lila moved through the palace halls with her usual humility, but something within her had shifted. The memory of the vampire king's shadowed presence lingered, a whisper at the edge of her thoughts. She did not yet understand who he was or why he had appeared at that exact moment, but his protection had ignited a strange combination of fear, awe, and curiosity inside her. Meanwhile, Kaelen observed her quietly from the shadows. Every small act of kindness she performed, tending to the animals, helping the servants, quietly correcting a young page who had spilled ink, held his attention. But there was more now. A subtle energy, faint yet undeniable, emanated from her. Kaelen had seen human power before, had seen warriors and kings manipulate armies and men, yet this was something different. Something raw, natural, and alive. It was during the preparations for a grand festival that Lila's secret began to reveal itself fully. The palace was adorned with velvet drapes, chandeliers flickering like captured stars, and tables heavy with golden platters. Nobles from far and wide had arrived, their laughter filling the hall with a fragile sense of gaiety. But beneath the surface, tension lingered. A mysterious illness had begun to spread among the guests. Some fell ill with sudden chills and pale skin. Others seemed weak, unable to eat or drink without fainting. Panic rippled through the crowd, whispered warnings spreading faster than any remedy could. Lila, finishing her chores, could not ignore what she saw. Despite her position as a maid, her compassion demanded action. She rushed to the side of a fainting guest, kneeling beside him as she whispered words of comfort. Her hands glowed softly as she touched his arm, warmth radiating outward. Slowly the pallor of illness faded, and the man's breathing steadied. Shocked murmurs rose among the nobles, but Lila barely noticed. She continued, moving from one guest to another, whispering comforting words, touching their foreheads and soothing their pain. One by one the ill began to recover. Kaelen, watching from a balcony above, felt a thrill of recognition and awe. She was not merely human. Her power was subtle, healing, and compassionate, but in its quiet way, it was profound. She did not wield her abilities with arrogance or demand. She simply acted out of instinct, out of kindness. And yet, in doing so, she demonstrated something Kaelen had long thought impossible: courage and strength hidden beneath a delicate, mortal form. That evening, as the guests recovered and whispered rumors of the miraculous girl spread, Kaelen descended into the hall. The nobles, still recovering from their illness, froze when they saw him enter. Even those who had previously mocked Lila sensed the danger in his gaze. Kaelen's presence was magnetic, terrifying, and yet, different tonight. There was no anger in his eyes, only observation, acknowledgement, and something softer: recognition. He approached Lila silently. She did not notice him at first, absorbed as she was intending to a guest whose illness had left him pale and weak. When she finally looked up, she froze at the sight of him. His dark eyes held centuries of power, wisdom, and mystery, yet they softened slightly as they met hers. "You do not yet understand your gift," Kaelen said, his voice low and commanding, carrying through the hall with a calm authority. "But I see it. And I will not allow anyone to harm you." Lila's heart pounded. She had never heard such words directed at her before. They were not mockery, nor pity, nor reprimand, they were acknowledgement. Protection. And yet, a shiver of fear ran down her spine. The man before her was not human. His presence carried the weight of centuries, of battles, of kingdoms ruled. She did not yet know his name, nor why he had intervened in her life, but instinctively she understood that this moment marked a turning point. Kaelen continued, stepping closer. "Your courage, your kindness, and your hidden strength are rare. Do not hide them out of fear. You are destined for more than suffering and humiliation." For the first time in her life, Lila felt the weight of her own potential. She had been invisible, powerless, and unnoticed for so long that the idea of recognition, of being seen for who she truly was, felt almost unreal. Yet here he was, a being whose power dwarfed anything she could imagine, acknowledging not just her acts of bravery but the very essence of her soul. As the night deepened, Kaelen departed as silently as he had arrived, leaving Lila with a lingering scent of moonlight and power. She sat alone, clutching her hands to her chest, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. Questions swirled in her mind. Who was he? Why did he care? What did it mean that he had noticed her power? The answers would not come immediately. Kaelen, patient and watchful, knew that the unfolding of destiny required careful timing. He would not rush her, nor would he reveal his full identity or intentions. Instead, he allowed her to discover her own abilities, to test them, and to begin understanding the significance of her gift. Over the following days, Lila experimented cautiously. She discovered that her abilities could not only heal physical wounds but also soothe emotional pain. A servant terrified of an angry master would calm under her gaze. A child crying from hunger or fear would settle in her arms. Her power was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably potent. And in each act she felt a strange sense of connection, not just to the people she helped but to the world at large. Kaelen continued to observe, increasingly fascinated by the human girl who was transforming before his eyes. He had lived for centuries, seen kingdoms rise and fall, and ruled with power that could crush anyone in moments. Yet Lila's quiet courage, her ability to endure hardship, and her innate gift touched something in him that no conquest or victory ever had. For the first time in his long existence, he felt that destiny was not merely a path of power and rule, but a story unfolding with a human heart at its center. The festival concluded, and the nobles returned to their quarters, whispering rumors of miraculous events and the strange girl who had healed the afflicted. Lila, exhausted but fulfilled, retreated to her own quarters. She touched the black rose that had appeared days before, still remembering the flutter of hope it had sparked within her. The events of the festival had confirmed one undeniable truth: she was no longer invisible. She had power, recognition, and, unknowingly, a protector who would watch over her. In the shadows of the palace, Kaelen lingered silently, contemplating the girl who had unknowingly captured his attention. Her power was growing, her courage was undeniable, and her heart remained pure despite the cruelty of the world around her. The slow, inevitable bond between mortal and immortal, human and vampire king, had begun in earnest. Lila's life, once defined by suffering and invisibility, was now entwined with a destiny far greater than she could yet comprehend. For Kaelen, centuries of waiting had brought him to this moment. For Lila, her quiet acts of kindness had finally begun to reveal the extraordinary life awaiting her. And as the moonlight filtered through the ornate windows, their fates quietly intertwined, setting the stage for the slow-burn romance, the danger, and the destiny that would unfold in the days to come. The palace had grown quieter in the weeks after the festival, yet the energy within its walls was electric, though invisible to most. Lila continued her work, tending to the halls, the animals, and the palace's unseen corners. She moved with careful diligence, carrying out each task with humility and a growing sense of confidence. The whispers of nobles had quieted, replaced by cautious respect from some, jealousy from others, and awe in those who had witnessed her abilities firsthand. But it wasn't the nobles or servants who captured her attention now. It was the shadow that moved silently through the corridors, the figure she glimpsed in the moonlight, watching her from a distance. Kaelen's presence was never overt, yet it was undeniable. His eyes, dark and piercing, followed her with a vigilance that made her pulse quicken whenever she felt it. She did not know why or how, but she felt safer with him near, as if his presence alone could ward off danger, ridicule, or misfortune. One evening, as Lila carried trays of fruit to the upper halls, she slipped and fell on the polished marble floor. The tray clattered and fruit rolled across the corridor. She gasped, expecting the laughter she had endured countless times before. But instead, a hand, pale and strong, grasped her elbow before she could hit the floor. "You must be more careful," Kaelen said softly, his voice carrying through the corridor with quiet authority. His eyes held no judgment, only concern. Lila's breath caught. She had expected reprimand or mockery, yet here was the vampire king, the same figure who had intervened before, expressing concern for her well-being. The sudden warmth in her chest was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Thank you," she stammered, her voice barely audible. Kaelen said nothing more, simply watching her gather the fallen fruit. But the intensity of his gaze lingered, making her hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. She felt as though he could see everything: the hidden tremor in her hands, the subtle hesitation in her steps, even the quiet pulse of fear beneath her calm exterior. And yet, instead of judgment, there was respect, acknowledgement, and something deeper, something almost tender. Over the following days, the interactions between them became more frequent, though subtle. A glance here, a fleeting touch there, a shadowed presence that seemed to appear whenever she faced danger or hardship. Kaelen did not speak much. His centuries of experience had taught him the power of observation. Words could confuse, intentions could mislead. Actions, however, were undeniable. And in his actions, always protective, always watchful, he communicated a message that needed no words: she was not alone. For Lila the effect was profound. She began to notice herself in a new light. Her confidence grew slowly, imperceptibly at first. She began helping others more openly, testing her powers with deliberate care, and taking small risks she would have never attempted before. The cruelty of the palace did not vanish, but it no longer defined her. Each small victory, each quiet act of courage, felt amplified by Kaelen's silent presence. It was as though the knowledge that someone powerful believed in her, without her asking, gave her strength she had never known. One night, a young page was cornered by a group of nobles seeking to humiliate him for spilling ink on a guest's gown. Lila intervened instinctively, stepping between the page and the nobles, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. The nobles laughed, mocking her, but Kaelen appeared as silently and decisively as ever. His eyes, dark and commanding, swept over the group, and the laughter died instantly. Even the most arrogant noble paled under his gaze. "You will leave him," Kaelen said, his tone low but carrying the authority of centuries. "Or you will answer to me." The nobles scattered, fleeing in panic. Lila felt her heart race, not from fear but from awe. She had faced cruelty countless times, but this was different. Here was someone whose power eclipsed any danger she had known. And yet, it was not the power alone that struck her, it was the subtle way he respected her courage, acknowledged her choices, and protected her without claiming dominance. As days turned into weeks, the emotional bond between them deepened. Lila began noticing the small things. The way Kaelen observed without intruding, how his presence could make danger dissipate, the faint glimmer of approval in his gaze when she acted with courage. And Kaelen, in turn, found himself captivated by her resilience, her kindness, and her quiet strength. He had ruled kingdoms, witnessed betrayal, conquered fear, and yet nothing had touched him like this human girl, this fragile, mortal girl whose heart was pure and whose courage was understated but undeniable. Their connection was subtle, unspoken, and almost painfully slow. Yet each interaction, each silent observation, built an intimacy that neither fully understood but both felt deeply. Kaelen, who had existed for centuries, feared vulnerability. Lila, who had lived in invisibility, feared exposure. And yet, in each other they found the beginnings of trust, the faintest whisper of companionship, and the glimmer of something far deeper, love. One evening Lila discovered a hidden chamber in the palace, a forgotten library filled with books on ancient knowledge, vampire lore, and healing arts. She explored it with reverence, brushing dust from tomes that had not been touched in centuries. It was there she uncovered a text describing a long-lost method to heal not only physical wounds but emotional ones, using a combination of human empathy and supernatural resonance, the very gift she possessed. Kaelen, appearing silently in the doorway, observed her fascination. He did not interrupt, but his presence was enough. She felt seen, not as a servant, not as a fragile girl, but as someone extraordinary. That silent acknowledgement, repeated countless times over weeks, created a bond beyond words. It was not passion, nor mere attraction. It was recognition, respect, and the beginnings of trust that could weather centuries. By the time dawn broke the next morning, Lila realized something profound. She had survived humiliation, faced danger, and discovered her own hidden abilities. And through it all, a silent, protective presence had guided her, allowed her to grow, and respected her autonomy. She did not yet know the full scope of Kaelen's identity or intentions, but she understood this. Her life, once defined by fear and invisibility, was no longer entirely her own. A bond had been forged, slow, subtle, yet unbreakable. And within that bond lay the promise of protection, understanding, and the eventual unfolding of a destiny that would change both of their lives forever. The Vampire King had waited 100 years. Lila, the human girl who had been invisible, fragile, and underestimated, was now becoming the heart of his attention, the focus of his centuries-long patience, and the one whose courage and kindness could finally awaken a heart thought forever closed. The emotional bond was no longer just observation. It was mutual, growing, and undeniable, setting the stage for destiny, romance, and the challenges yet to come. The palace had never been quieter, or more tense. The months since the festival had changed everything. Lila had grown stronger, her confidence deepened, and her secret power had blossomed into a force she could barely understand. She had healed the sick, calmed frightened animals, and even begun to soothe the invisible wounds of those around her. Yet despite her growing abilities, danger still lingered. A rival vampire faction, long aware of Kaelen's centuries-long rule, had begun to stir. Rumors of unrest reached the palace halls. Whispers of conspiracies, of vampires plotting against the throne, and of humans caught in the crossfire. For the first time Lila felt fear, not for herself, but for the man who had silently become the anchor of her world. Kaelen, who had waited a century for a spark of destiny, was no longer just a distant protector. He had become part of her life in ways that could no longer be ignored. That night, as Lila walked through the moonlit courtyard, she sensed danger before she saw it. Figures moved with predatory grace among the shadows. Before she could react, a dagger flashed in the air. Her heart raced and instinct took over. She whispered the ancient words she had discovered months before, and warmth radiated from her hands. The air shimmered around her, and the assailant stumbled, caught in an invisible force of her own creation. Kaelen emerged from the darkness, his presence immediate and terrifying. With a single motion, he intercepted the second attacker, fangs glinting in the moonlight. The air was thick with tension, the courtyard a battlefield between human resilience, supernatural power, and centuries of preparation. Lila felt her pulse surge, not with fear but with the realization that she was no longer powerless. She had been trained, nurtured, and observed, and her courage now matched the danger she faced. Together they moved with a fluid, unspoken coordination. Kaelen's centuries of combat blended seamlessly with Lila's emerging powers, creating a harmony neither had experienced before. The attackers faltered, realizing too late that their prey was no longer a fragile human girl. She was the heart of a force they could not comprehend, a combination of human bravery, supernatural ability, and a bond with a vampire king who had waited 100 years to find her. When the battle finally ended, the assailants fled into the shadows, leaving the courtyard still and quiet. Lila's hands trembled, glowing faintly even as the danger passed. Kaelen approached her, his dark eyes softer now, filled with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, relief, pride, and an undeniable connection. "You have surpassed all expectations," Kaelen said, his voice low and intimate. "You are stronger than you realize, stronger than many I have seen in centuries." Lila, breathless and shaken, met his gaze. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. She stopped, realizing the truth of her words. His presence had always been more than protection. It had been belief, acknowledgement, and the patience to let her discover herself. He had never forced her, never overshadowed her courage, and never claimed her victories as his own. Kaelen took her hand gently, his touch warm, grounding, and electric all at once. "You did this yourself, Lila. I only watched, waited, and guided. This is your strength. And now your destiny is clear." Her heart skipped a beat. Destiny. The word had haunted her dreams for months, whispered in shadows, carried in the black rose, and echoed in her secret power. And now it was no longer a mystery. Kaelen's gaze held the answer she had been seeking. She was meant to be more than a servant, more than an overlooked girl. She was meant to stand beside him, not as a fragile human, but as someone extraordinary in her own right. The moonlight fell across the courtyard, illuminating their faces. Kaelen's fangs glinted faintly as he leaned closer, and for the first time the centuries of his solitude, the power he wielded, and the fear he had inspired all softened in her presence. He had waited patiently for a century for a soul like hers, someone courageous, kind, and uniquely gifted. And now, after countless trials, humiliation endured, and courage tested, he had found her. "You are mine," Kaelen murmured, not in possessiveness but in acknowledgement. Not in ownership but in destiny. "You have earned your place, by your courage, your kindness, and your heart." Tears filled Lila's eyes, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had truly seen her. Not the servant, not the fragile girl, not the invisible outcast, but the real her. And not only had he seen her, but he had believed in her, waited for her, and now stood beside her as her equal in a world that had never allowed equality before. In that moment, the bond between human and vampire king solidified. It was a bond forged in courage, nurtured through patience, and tested by danger. Lila's heart raced as she finally stepped forward, closing the small distance between them. Kaelen's hand lingered on hers, protective yet tender. Their eyes locked, and the centuries between them felt irrelevant. Time, fear, and suffering had brought them here, to a quiet understanding that transcended words. "You are no longer invisible," Kaelen said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You never will be again." The palace around them was silent, bathed in moonlight, yet within that silence, a profound truth resonated. Lila had endured every cruelty, every humiliation, and every trial. She had discovered her power, her courage, and her heart. And in doing so, she had drawn the attention of a being who had waited a century for someone exactly like her, a human girl with the strength to meet destiny head-on. As dawn approached, they stood together in the courtyard, the first light of morning glinting on marble and rose petals. Lila felt an unspoken promise in Kaelen's gaze, protection, respect and love that had grown slowly, deliberately and unshakably. She understood at last that her journey, from invisibility to recognition, from fragility to power, was complete. For Kaelen, the centuries of waiting, the solitude, the endless vigilance, all had led to this one perfect moment. He had found the human girl who had changed everything. Her courage had matched his patience, her kindness had matched his power, and her heart had opened a door he thought long closed. Together they would face the world, unyielding and unstoppable. The vampire king who had waited 100 years had finally found the human girl whose strength, bravery and kindness had awakened him, and whose destiny was inseparable from his own. Lila smiled, a mixture of relief, awe and love. For the first time in her life she felt truly seen, truly powerful and truly destined. And as Kaelen lowered his head toward her, the centuries between them dissolved, leaving only the promise of protection, companionship, and an unbreakable bond that would endure forever. The story of the invisible girl who became extraordinary had reached its fulfillment. From suffering to courage, from invisibility to destiny, Lila and Kaelen's paths had intertwined, and nothing would ever separate them again. The vampire king had waited 100 years and now, at last, destiny was fulfilled.